She's Connecticut's first female state fire marshal. We talk with Lauri Volkert about her new role, her firefighting history, as well as the challenges she sees for her office ahead in 2025. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. We're watching the news currently and seeing the devastating wildfires on the West Coast and around Los Angeles and the damage they are inflicting on people, their homes, and the environment. So it's apt that this week's interview is with Connecticut's new fire marshal, Lauri Volkert. Volkert has been in office now for just over a month, and I sat down with her recently to talk about her new role, her firefighting history in the state, and we talked about the wildfires that Connecticut saw itself last year. We are talking to Lauri Volkert, who is the new state fire marshal for the state of Connecticut. Just a month in as well. Lauri, how's it going?
It's going great. It's definitely a big change from being a local fire marshal, stepping into this new state role, but I have been welcomed by the team and I'm really excited about the opportunities that this kind of larger scope presents in promoting fire safety across the state of Connecticut.
You step into some very big shoes. William Abbott, retired, who was the previous state fire marshal, did that for 19 years, I believe, 25 years as a firefighter. You also had many years in firefighting as well. Why did you want to step into this role? Obviously, we need a state fire marshal, but what attracted you to it?
So I started in the fire service young, following in my father's footsteps. He was a volunteer firefighter. I grew up going to the firehouse with him, joined on my 16th birthday. And I fell in love with it as a kid, pursued it in college, and then realized that through experiences and internships that fire prevention and working in the fire marshal's office is really the most effective way to have a positive influence in the fire service. We always think of firefighters as the guys running into buildings that are on fire, rescuing people, all of that type of thing. But fire prevention is really where it's at if you want to make a meaningful difference in your community, the biggest bang for your buck. And so I got into this and the role of fire marshal, all of the other stuff in the fire service. So we're talking about fire safety, going out and presenting to community members, getting to visit the schools and hand out the plastic fire hats that everyone remembers from Fire Prevention Week. But also doing fire investigations, figuring out the origin and cause of fires, and doing fire code enforcement and making sure that people have safe buildings to live, work, and play in. And so I've been doing that at the local level in Windsor, have been doing that for about 15 years. And then the opportunity presented itself to move up to the state level. And I'm excited to see where I'm able to build my network and really assist other local fire marshals in being effective. Keeping their community safe.
You are the first female state fire marshal. I'm sorry it's an obvious question. What challenges do you think that brings? Because it's always that thing, isn't it? You're breaking the glass ceiling. It's great to have that diversity, but there's always that question is, what other challenges does that bring being the first female state fire marshal?
So even though I'm the first state fire marshal in the state, I'm not the first female state fire marshal across the country. And so have a great network of other folks to chat with. And everyone's been very welcoming in the office. The state building inspector is also a woman. So it's a supportive atmosphere, but it's also exciting to break that glass ceiling and know that even though I'm the first, hopefully I won't be the last. And recognizing that the fire code enforcement and fire prevention activities is a great job, regardless of gender. And so hopefully we can inspire some more women to get into the fire service.
Like you said, you've had a very long career of being a firefighter and being in the fire service. But I mentioned this before we started the interview. I was just having a quick look at a social media site that you're on. And you were once a junior high school science and health teacher, which is great. So from teacher to firefighter, what made you like, jump from education, from that type of education to a different type of education?
So my undergraduate degree is in fire science, but when I graduated, the economy kind of tanked and nobody was hiring firefighters at the time. And so I had a connection with this particular school, and they were looking for somebody with a science background to help out with teaching junior high science and health. And so I was able to step into that role, get a temporary teaching license based on my undergrad, and then did that for a little bit. And as fate would have it, I was actually teaching at a school in the town where I had done my internship when I was an undergrad in the fire marshal's office. And they had some changes in staffing and had a position open. And so the fire marshal actually came to do a inspection at the school and pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you should apply for this job at the fire marshal's office." And the rest is history. So that was how I made my jump from teaching over. But there's been a lot of transferable skills. I learned a lot doing that and gave me a real comfort in the classroom settings. One of the big things as a fire marshal is teaching both at community level, talking in classrooms, having that familiarity with how to teach, how to manage a classroom, but also have the opportunity to speak at a number of conferences and put together continuing education classes for adult learners who are in the fire service. And so that time teaching really has served me well, and it has paid huge dividends moving forward in terms of transferable skills.
How long was the process for you to become the new state fire marshal? Because I'm guessing there was a lot of competition for that job because it is the top fire job in the state.
I'm not sure how long the process was on the state side, but I know that it was a few rounds of interviews and about a month through the process here, and then spent some time closing down my responsibilities in Windsor before moving up here into the office.
So, as we said, just a month into the job. So, what are some of the things that you want to put your stamp on, as it were, for 2025?
So we're in the middle of the code adoption process. And so we're in the middle of figuring out the minutia of what the fire code's going to look like moving forward for the next few years. And so that's taking up a lot of our time. But most of the time spent here in the office is in support of local fire marshals. And I would love to provide more support to local fire marshals when it comes to teaching about fire prevention and how to make what we do in the code and fire investigations, and taking some of that technical knowledge and helping folks translate that into something that's easy to share with community members. So that way we can get them on board as partners in fire safety. Because, there's only so much we can do if we're doing an inspection for that half hour that we're in the building. But as soon as we leave, we don't know what happens inside that building. But if we can promote fire safety through education and getting those partners, convince folks who own buildings, work in buildings, that fire safety is in their best interest, and kind of train them to see what those fire safety things, tips and tricks are, then we can have multiple eyes on all of these buildings throughout the state and really get people to take ownership of their own safety. So I think that's really my biggest thing.
Looking at the website actually for administrative services of which you come under, it says Office of the State Fire Marshal. There's quite a long list of things that your office, a lot of people probably wouldn't think that you would get involved in. I'm looking at one here, the licensing of demolition contractors, crane operators, hoisting operators, and registration of cranes. There's a lot of very different skill sets, lots of very different industries, and also it appears a lot of working with multiple agencies as well here in the state. Can you just give us a bit of a sense of all of that?
I've always thought of the fire marshal's office as the Swiss Army knife of the fire service, where we're doing a lot of different jobs in a lot of different directions. And so here at the state level, like you mentioned, we're involved in licensing and investigations for cranes, hoisting, demolition contractors. We also maintain records for all of the burn injuries across the state. We're the clearinghouse for the national fire reporting information across the states. We hold those records. And then we're also, like I said, providing local support to local fire marshals, reviewing requests for modifications for the state fire code for different existing buildings. But then also we're tasked with inspecting all of the state-owned buildings for fire safety compliance and doing the plan review and construction inspections for those state projects as well. And then we also may provide certifications for fire safe cigarettes and do product reviews and things like that. So we have a lot of different responsibilities in a lot of different areas.
How is it working with the other state agencies? Because we've got a lot of state agencies, they've got their jobs as well. I'm guessing that's quite an interesting sort of job working and getting them to understand where you're coming from and vice versa.
Working at the local level, that was always one of my favorite things about being in the fire marshal's office was building those partnerships interdepartmentally and working with other community partners, whether it was social services, the police department, et cetera. And so I'm really excited to be able to connect those skills to build those relationships here in the state of Connecticut. We have a very close working relationship with the Office of State Building Inspector and Construction Services. We're working on all of those state projects. And the fire code and building code really work hand in hand to keep buildings safe both during construction and then afterwards. But I'm looking forward to working with all of the other departments as well. As building owners, we're helping them keep their buildings safe. But then also, I see that there's a lot of opportunity to meet the needs of the most vulnerable residents here in Connecticut and making sure that we can work together to remove barriers to safety.
One of the things that we see in the modern world that we live in is that sadly people aren't volunteering as much as they used to. And of course, the fire service, a lot of it depends very much on volunteers. What are you seeing here in Connecticut? Are we still at a point where we're like desperately need a lot more firefighters? And if so, is that something that your department will be working or is possibly responsible for working towards to try and engage people and get them interested in becoming firefighters?
So absolutely. The Connecticut in particular, and definitely across the region, we have a strong history of the volunteer fire service here in Connecticut. And I'm sure that if folks talk to their local volunteer fire department, I'm not sure any of them would turn folks away necessarily for volunteers. They're all looking for volunteers. And it's a big commitment. But I also know that fire departments are starting to pivot a little bit and recognizing that a volunteer firefighter may not look the same way that it was assumed they would look a generation or two ago, and recognizing that it takes all types of skills and abilities to make the organization run. But all of the fire departments are locally managed, whether it's a private volunteer organization that's contracted by the town or a town organization. So they don't necessarily fall under my chain of command to use my position to really get information out there and let folks know that the volunteer fire service is a great way to serve their communities and to promote safety.
Do you foresee, not just maybe for firefighters, but for other volunteering jobs, that things will have to change a bit, maybe some more incentives or something to try and make sure that we keep those numbers up? Because obviously the service will suffer greatly if they can't get the numbers there, and then that rolls into public safety as well.
I think that a lot of communities are already starting to look at that, looking at different types of incentives. I know here in the state of Connecticut, municipalities are able to give discounts on property taxes, other types of incentives, length of insurance, pensions, those types of things for volunteer firefighters. And a number of them do mileage reimbursement or some type of stipend reimbursement for those. So those are really great tools. But I think another way that we can help preserve the volunteer fire service is by really good fire code enforcement and good fire prevention. And we're able to build buildings that are safer and get folks to pay attention to the common causes of fire. Most causes of fire are preventable. If we look at unattended cooking or people who fall asleep smoking, those types of things are really easily preventable with just a little bit more care and attention. And so if we were able to reduce the occurrence of fires and also provide safer buildings, then that's going to help the volunteer fire service be able to focus their efforts where they're really needed instead of responding to ever increasing numbers of calls for service.
How do you see like modern technology helping you to achieve that?
I would love to get more involved working with other partners across the state to promote fire safety through education, utilizing social media to get the message out, partnering with other organizations to get the information out. Because I recognize that not everyone's going to follow me in particular on social media or my office. But if we can get the information out and build that connective tissue between different fire departments and different organizations, then I think that could get the message out even more clearly. And I'm looking forward to being able to use access to all of the data and information that we hold in the state fire marshal's office to help us refine that messaging so it's really particular and localized, using community risk reduction as a model for deciding where we're going to spend our time and money in making those fire prevention messages, PSAs, those types of things. So we can make sure that we're actually focused on what's causing risk here locally in Connecticut.
The other thing, of course, which was a big media point a couple of years ago, and it's an ongoing thing, is AFFF foam, and it's something that the fire service used to use a lot of, and obviously constantly looking at ways to use different things which are maybe less harmful on the environment. Where are we with that situation?
There's been a lot of research in the realms of using new chemicals, like you mentioned, the green foam to replace the AFFF or the PFAS, but then also better sprinkler systems, better types of extinguishers. There's been a big push for a new standard for smoke alarms so now they're being tested to reduce nuisance alarms and to make sure that they're sensitive to all types of fires, because we noticed that on modern home furnishings, fires are burning differently than they were 20 and 30 years ago. And so we needed to upgrade that technology. And so that testing standard is now becoming common practice. And there's always new technology. And I think that's really exciting. And I look forward to this office being able to get information out to local fire marshals who may not have the information coming in directly. They have a lot of responsibilities on their shoulders, and so may not see all of these journal articles popping up or newer technology. So really hoping that my office can serve in that respect to get that information out there and to provide good information both to the fire service and to the community at large about these different fire safety tools.
Yeah, because like you were saying, I've done a little bit of research, obviously, on some of these things. And like you said, some of the furniture and even things like siding on people's houses burn hotter. So, of course, it just causes you guys more issues when you're trying to deal with that. And I don't think that's something that the public always comprehend or understand. They just think, oh, it's a fire. No, it's not just the fire. There's so many more things involved in dealing with that and how to safely put it out. One thing I will just quickly ask you, were you involved or keeping an eye on, obviously, all the brush fires that we had? Because, of course, that was a big deal for us in 2024. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have two main wildfire seasons here in Connecticut. One that's normal that we saw was October, November, and then also March until things start greening up. But those shoulder seasons are really where we have the highest risk for wildfires here in Connecticut. Unfortunately, the fall wildfire season coincided with a pretty nasty drought that we had. And so it was very dry here in the state for a number of weeks. And so we saw a number of wildfires. And it's one of those things that it's always been a risk here in Connecticut, but just because the hazard hasn't been as big as maybe out west where we're seeing millions of acres burning, just by the lay of the land, we don't see those types of fires normally here in Connecticut, but it's always a hazard. We've had a wildfire season twice a year for a long time. And so it was a good reminder for everyone to pay attention to those outdoor fire safety hazards and really to think smartly about how they're using fire and open flames out of doors.
And without sounding overly dramatic, you juxtapositioned about out west, and we're always sadly seeing those pictures of acres and acres burning. But I'm guessing it's actually more of a concern here when it does happen, because we are such a smaller state. And yes, we do have obviously the wooded areas and forests, but also we're more densely populated as well. The chances actually of a brush fire impacting somebody's property or properties is greater, I'm guessing, than possibly some of the areas out west.
Absolutely. We have a lot more people who are living in that wildland urban interface. We call it the WUI in the fire service. And we have a very high percentage of our population that lives in that in between area of the woods and the suburbs. And we're very interconnected with all of those woodlands here. And so when there is a brush fire that's burning through woodland, it can sadly affect a number of homes. And so it's really important that people pay attention and use fire wisely outside and make sure that campfires are put completely out, that they're clearing brush from away from their home. And that if they are going to use sparklers or things like that, that they're being careful about it and make sure that everything's fully extinguished before they get rid of it.
It's been great talking to you. And again, congratulations on becoming our state fire marshal. We look forward to hearing more from your department as you continue to reach out to the community. But in the meantime, Lauri Volkert, ever so many thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you very much. It was great to speak with you, Brian.
And you can find out more about the Office of the State Fire Marshal by visiting the official website at portal.ct.gov/DAS/Office of State Fire Marshal.
The more you listen to your kids, the closer you'll be. So we asked kids, what do you want your parents to hear?
I feel sometimes that I'm not listened to. I would just want you to listen to me more often and evaluate situations with me and lead me towards success.
Listening is a form of love. Find resources to help you support your kids and their emotional well-being at sounditouttogether.org. That's sounditouttogether.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and Pivotal.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week. The 2025 Connecticut legislative session kicked off on January 8th with Governor Lamont making his 7th State of the State address to a joint session of the General Assembly. Lamont's focus was on making Connecticut more affordable while also providing more opportunities for state residents. He also addressed the need for the state to deal with its growing need on energy and lowering the cost of electricity, recognizing residents and businesses' discontent at high prices that impact everyone. The governor also talked about improving the regulatory and licensing environment in the state, especially around the challenge of new construction and housing. Lamont also made a commitment to education and young people and helping municipalities with educational cost-sharing funding. Not everyone was happy with Lamont's remarks, though. The Connecticut Community Nonprofit Alliance said the state needs to be more supportive of their sector and increase funding as demand for their services continue to increase and their buying power is 30% lower than it was back in 2007. U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal, the incoming ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, joined veterans and service providers recently to announce the passage of the bipartisan, bicameral Senator Elizabeth Dole 21st Century Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act. The new legislation includes a number of reforms and proposals to improve the delivery of healthcare, benefits, and services at the Department of Veterans Affairs for veterans, their families, and their survivors. Blumenthal said one of the new reforms is an increase in per diem compensation for transitional housing providers for veterans.
They not only provide a roof over veterans' heads, but also the services they need to go from homelessness to shelters to transitional housing and then to permanent homes. That's the objective. It's a wraparound kind of program, but it costs more than we have been providing. The increase from 115% to 133% of the domiciliary rate is a very significant step forward.
Vince Santilli is the CEO of the non-profit Homes for the Brave and said although he and other service providers like his organization are grateful for the new legislation in helping them keep their doors and services open to veterans, he says the state of Connecticut itself needs to be doing more.
We're in a state that in the last session paid down $940 million in debt. But the way I look at it, before you start paying down that much debt, you should make sure that all of the people that are in need, like veterans that have served all of us and are now experiencing homelessness, hunger, and mental health issues, then the organizations like Homes for the Brave that serve them should be receiving support.
Two recent national surveys by tech nonprofit Smile Hub and loan company Lending Tree placed Connecticut 50th and 47th, respectively, against other states in the country when it came to looking after veterans. The nonpartisan environmental nonprofit, the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, held its annual environmental summit just before the state started its 2025 legislative session. The organization is celebrating its 25th anniversary, helping to protect Connecticut's natural resources and holding legislators accountable for their voting on environmental matters. Lauri Brown is the executive director of the league and said with a new federal administration coming in, there will be challenges ahead.
We will certainly see efforts by the incoming Trump administration to roll back federal protections, including the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. We know that the targets are on those two pieces of important core federal laws. Connecticut must also be a solid and reliable regional partner with our neighboring New England states to ensure that we continue to move forward together on clean energy like offshore wind and not increase our reliance on dirty oil and gas.
Comedian and climate activist Chuck Nice was the event's keynote speaker and had a clear message for the attendees.
Most Americans, more than 65%, between 65 and 70% of Americans, say that they rarely or never discuss global warming and climate crisis with family and friends. Now, do you think we can actually solve this issue if people aren't even talking about it with their family and their friends? There's no way that it can ever happen.
The summit also addressed other environmental issues, such as the phasing out of the use of neonics, the most widely used insecticide in the US, that has been linked to the massive loss of bees and other pollinators, as well as declining bird populations that ingest the poison. And Connecticut educators and public sector workers are celebrating passage of the Social Security Fairness Act recently. Edwin J. Vieira of the Connecticut News Service has more.
The new federal law repeals 2 provisions that had reduced Social Security benefits for some public sector workers who also receive a pension. Those workers nationwide will now be eligible for benefits they would have earned in 2024. Kate Diaz with the Connecticut Education Association says passing this law rights a 40-year-old wrong.
The government chose erroneously to penalize public service employees to try and balance Social Security, and it was never a just cause. So it's great to see this overturned, money returned to people who have rightfully earned it.
Supporters of the change say the biggest challenge to passing the law was that many people were unaware of these limits for public employees. Some critics charge this could speed up the timeline for Social Security's insolvency, but Diaz feels there's more work to do, including higher teacher salaries to reflect the education required to do the work. Reports show most Connecticut salaries don't keep up with the cost of living. I'm Edwin J. Vieira.
And former President Jimmy Carter was remembered by the nation during a day of mourning on January 9th. The day of mourning coincided with a state funeral in Washington, D.C., presided over by President Biden. Biden declared January 9th a day of mourning for Carter, who served as president from 1977 to 1981 before becoming a renowned humanitarian and linked with the nonprofit Habitat for Humanity. A national day of mourning is a day to honor and pay respects to a revered public figure who has died, most commonly a U.S. president. The most recent president to be honored with a national day of mourning was George H.W. Bush after his death in December 2018. The tradition began in 1865 with a one-day government shutdown 6 weeks after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, according to the New York Times. While several presidents have been honored with a day of mourning in the subsequent years, others have been commemorated as well. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy were each honored with a national day of mourning after they were assassinated in 1968. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms, on demand, and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow, and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.